The champagne was poisoned. The waitress knew it. The billionaire had 30 seconds to live. But the 3 words she scribbled on that napkin weren't just a warning. They were about to uncover a secret that would destroy everything he thought he knew about his past. That if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button for more. Also, share your thoughts, and let me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow's story is going to be just as epic, so don't miss out. Now, let's continue. She pressed the folded napkin into his champagne glass with hands steady as steel, and when billionaire Richard Musk read the 3 words scrawled in desperate ink, he realized the elegant party around him wasn't a celebration, it was his funeral. That if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button for more. Also, share your thoughts, and let me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow's story is going to be just as epic, so don't miss out. Now, let's continue. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Grandview Ballroom as Richard Musk adjusted his black tie and surveyed the crowd of Manhattan's elite. At 48, he stood 6'2" with the kind of presence that commanded rooms. Broad shoulders that had carried the weight of a tech empire, steel gray eyes that had stared down senators and toes alike, and salt and pepper hair that added distinguished authority to his angular face. Tonight, dressed in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, he looked every inch the billionaire who had revolutionized 3 industries before his 40th birthday. But beneath the confident exterior, Richard's mind was calculating threats like a computer processing data. 6 assassination attempts in 2 years. Poisoned coffee in his penthouse. A car bomb that had claimed his driver instead of him. Snipers on rooftops during board meetings. His competitors had grown tired of losing market share to Musk Industries and had decided that elimination was more cost-effective than innovation. The invitation to Marcus Blackwood's last party had arrived with golden script on black cardstock, elegant and ominous. Richard knew it was a trap. His security team had begged him not to attend. His lawyers had drafted emergency succession plans. But Richard Musk hadn't built a $40 billion empire by hiding from danger. "If they want me dead," he'd told his head of security that morning, "they'll keep trying until they succeed. At least this way, I choose the battlefield." Now, as he moved through the crowd of familiar faces, senators, judges, tech moguls, and oil barons, Richard felt the familiar weight of isolation that had haunted him since his meteoric rise to power. Every smile might hide a conspirator. Every handshake could deliver poison. Every conversation was a potential intelligence-gathering mission. He'd forgotten what it felt like to trust another human being. 26 floors below, in the service corridors of the Grandview Hotel, Vanessa Hund tied her black apron with practiced efficiency and checked her reflection in the stainless steel surface of a serving cart. At 24, she was petite and lean from years of physical work, standing 5'5" in her regulation black flats. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the mandatory bun, revealing a heart-shaped face with high cheekbones and startling green eyes that seemed too old for her years. A small scar above her left eyebrow, courtesy of her last foster home, was the only visible reminder of a childhood that had taught her to survive by being invisible. Vanessa had been working at the Grandview for 8 months, ever since she'd aged out of the foster system. With nothing but a high school diploma and an unshakable work ethic. She'd bounced between 3 jobs before landing the waitressing position, and she guarded it fiercely. The pay was decent, the tips from high society events were generous, and most importantly, nobody asked questions about her past. What made Vanessa exceptional wasn't her service skills, though she'd perfected those out of necessity. It was her ability to become part of the furniture, invisible enough that people said things around her they'd never say in front of their peers. She'd learned that rich people treated service staff like they were deaf and blind, which made her privy to conversations that would make front-page news. Tonight's party was different, though. The usual chatter about stock prices and political donations had been replaced by hushed conversations that stopped whenever she approached. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with the sterling silver knives she'd been polishing all afternoon. And then there was the conversation she'd overheard in the coat check room. The champagne service at 11:15, Marcus Blackwood had whispered to a man she recognized as Vincent Kane, Richard's biggest competitor in the renewable energy sector. The glass with the etched rose stem. Make sure she delivers it personally. And the girl? Kane had asked. Disposable, Blackwood had replied with the casual indifference of a man discussing the weather. Heart attack. Natural causes. Very sad. Vanessa had pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering as the implications sank in. They weren't just planning to kill Richard Musk, they were planning to frame her for it, then eliminate the only witness. Her years in foster care had taught her to recognize predators, and these men wore their evil in expensive suits. For a normal person, the smart move would be to run. Call in sick, disappear into the city, let someone else worry about the billionaire's fate. But Vanessa had spent her entire life being disposable to other people, shuffled between homes, dismissed by teachers, overlooked by potential adoptive families who wanted younger, prettier, less damaged children. Tonight, she finally had the chance to matter. Would you risk your life to save a stranger? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the most powerless people are the ones with the most power to change everything. As she wheeled her cart of champagne glasses toward the ballroom service entrance, Vanessa's mind raced through her options. The police wouldn't believe a foster kid waitress over Marcus Blackwood. Security would throw her out before she could get close to their target. And every passing minute brought them closer to 11:15. She had one chance. One moment to save a life and maybe, just maybe, prove that someone who'd been thrown away her entire life was worth something after all. The ballroom doors opened, and Vanessa stepped into a world of glittering gowns and predatory smiles. Classical music floated through air thick with expensive perfume and barely concealed malice. She moved through the plus, rowed like a ghost, searching for the man whose life hung in the balance. That's when she saw him. Richard Musk stood near the orchestra, a picture of calm confidence in his tailored tuxedo, completely unaware that he was surrounded by people who wanted him dead. Up close, he was even more imposing than his magazine photos suggested, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people step aside without realizing they were doing it. But what struck Vanessa most was the isolation in his steel-gray eyes, the way he held himself apart even in a crowd of hundreds. He looked as alone as she'd felt her entire life. Time slowed as Vanessa approached, the poisoned champagne glass growing heavy in her hand. 11:10. 5 minutes until they expected her to deliver death in crystal stemware. Richard's eyes found hers across the room, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in their depths. Not recognition, but awareness. The way a soldier might notice movement in his peripheral vision. This was it. The moment that would define both their lives. Vanessa reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a cocktail napkin, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had 30 seconds to write 3 words that would save a life and change everything. 3 words that would stop the most powerful man in the room cold. Vanessa's pen trembled against the cocktail napkin as the grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11:12. 3 minutes. 3 minutes until Marcus Blackwood expected her to hand Richard Musk his death sentence in a crystal glass. The ballroom swirled around her in a kaleidoscope of silk gowns and tuxedos, but her world had narrowed to the white napkin in her hands and the 3 words that could save a life. Champagne is poisoned. She folded the napkin with surgical precision, her fingers working with the kind of steady control that came from years of hiding fear. Around her, the party continued its elegant charade, senators laughing at jokes that weren't funny, oil barons discussing environmental policies with straight faces, tech moguls pretending to be friends while plotting each other's downfall. Richard stood 15 feet away, engaged in conversation with Judge Morrison about some legal technicality, but Vanessa could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes occasionally swept the room like a predator sensing danger. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. At 11:13, Vincent Kane appeared at her elbow like a shadow materializing from smoke. At 62, he was thin and sharp-featured, with the kind of cold smile that never reached his pale blue eyes. His manicured hand settled on her wrist with deceptive gentleness. "Miss Hund," his voice was silk over steel, "I believe it's time for the champagne service." Vanessa's training kicked in. Years of foster homes had taught her to hide terror behind compliance. "Of course, sir." "Right away." She lifted the tray, feeling the weight of the poisoned glass among the innocent ones. The etched rose on its stem caught the chandelier light like a beacon of death. Kane's fingers tightened on her wrist, and she felt the subtle pressure that said, "We're watching you." "The gentleman by the orchestra," Kane murmured, his breath cold against her ear. "The tall one with the gray eyes. Make sure he gets the special glass." "Yes, sir." Kane released her with a smile that promised consequences if she failed. "Such a good girl. Your grandmother would be proud." The casual cruelty of the lie. Vanessa had never known her grandmother, had never known any family, nearly broke her composure. But she nodded and moved toward Richard with steady steps, the folded napkin burning like a coal in her palm. 11:14. The crowd seemed to part before her as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Conversations dimmed to whispers. The orchestra's waltz took on a funeral cadence. Every step felt like walking through water, time stretching and compressing until she stood 3 feet from the most powerful man in the room. Richard turned toward her, and their eyes met properly for the first time. Up close, she could see the silver flecks in his gray irises, the faint lines that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. There was something in his expression, a flicker of curiosity, as if he'd noticed her earlier and wondered why she seemed different from the other staff. "Champagne, sir?" Her voice was steady, professional, giving no hint of the life-or-death drama playing out beneath the surface. "Thank you." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with the kind of quiet authority that could command boardrooms and Senate hearings. This was the moment. Vanessa lifted the tray, her movements deliberate and graceful. The poisoned glass with its etched rose stems sat prominently in the center, exactly where Kane expected it to be. Richard's hand moved toward it, and she felt time fracture into crystalline shards. Instead of presenting the tray for him to choose, Vanessa did something that would replay in both their minds for years to come. She pressed the folded napkin directly into his champagne glass. Not the poisoned one, but a clean glass from the edge of the tray, her green eyes locking onto his gray ones with desperate intensity. "Your champagne, Mr. Musk," she whispered, using his real name for the first time, her voice barely audible above the orchestra. Richard's hand froze halfway to the glass. The use of his surname, not the alias he'd been using at business functions, but his actual name, sent electricity through his system. His fingers closed around the glass, feeling the foreign weight of the napkin inside. For 3 heartbeats, they stood frozen in a tableau that looked perfectly normal to observers but contained the entire universe to them. Richard's gray eyes searched her face, finding something there that made his pulse quicken. Not attraction, though that would come later, but recognition. The recognition of one survivor looking at another. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice carrying layers of meaning she wasn't ready to understand. Vanessa stepped back, her part played, but she couldn't make herself walk away. She watched as Richard raised the glass toward his lips, then paused, his eyes never leaving hers. With movements that seemed casual but were loaded with intention, he swirled the champagne gently, feeling the napkin move inside the glass. 11:15. Marcus Blackwood appeared as if summoned by the clock's chime, his politician's smile bright and predatory. "Richard, there you are. I was hoping we could toast to new beginnings." Richard's grip tightened on the glass, and Vanessa saw the exact moment he understood. The timing, the host's sudden appearance, the careful choreography of the evening. His jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, and when he looked at her again, his eyes held a question that made her knees weak. "Did you just save my life?" "Marcus." Richard's voice was perfectly controlled, giving nothing away. "What an interesting party." "Oh, the night is young," Blackwood replied, his eyes flicking to the glass in Richard's hand. "I do hope you'll drink up. The champagne is quite special tonight." The words hung in the air like a sword over silk. Vanessa felt Vincent Kane's gaze boring into her back, felt the weight of consequences pressing down like a physical force. Everything depended on what happened in the next 30 seconds. Richard raised the glass higher, and for a terrifying moment, Vanessa thought he might actually drink. But instead, he tilted his head slightly and said, "You know, Marcus, I've been thinking about what you said earlier about new beginnings. Perhaps we should discuss it somewhere more private." "Of course." Blackwood's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "But surely you want to, actually," Richard's voice cut through the suggestion like a blade, "I find I'm not in the mood for champagne tonight." He set the glass down on a nearby table with deliberate care, the napkin still hidden inside, and Vanessa felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. Around them, the party continued its elegant dance of deception, but she could feel the shift in energy, the subtle ripple of confusion spreading through the conspirators. Richard's eyes found hers one more time across the small distance between them, and in that look was everything they couldn't say out loud. Gratitude. Recognition. The beginning of something that neither of them had words for yet. Then Kane was beside her again, his manicured fingers biting into her elbow with barely controlled fury. "Miss Hund," his voice was ice wrapped in velvet, "I believe there's been a mistake with the service. Perhaps you should take a break." It wasn't a suggestion. Vanessa nodded, her training keeping her face neutral even as terror clawed at her chest. As Kane steered her toward the service entrance, she risked one last glance over her shoulder. Richard was watching her go, his steel-gray eyes burning with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. In that moment, she realized she wasn't just walking away from the man she'd saved. She was walking toward the consequences of defying people who treated human lives like business expenses, and somewhere in the space between. Her fear and his gratitude, something unprecedented began to bloom, the kind of connection that could survive anything the world threw at it, if they lived long enough to find out. The service corridor felt like a tomb compared to the glittering ballroom, its harsh fluorescent lights stripping away any pretense of elegance. Vanessa's footsteps echoed against concrete walls as Vincent Kane guided her deeper into the hotel's bowels, his grip on her elbow tight enough to leave bruises. "You disappoint me, Miss Hund." Kane's voice was conversational, almost fatherly, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Such a promising young woman. Reliable work history. Clean background check. No family to ask awkward questions. They passed the industrial laundry room, its machines humming like mechanical heartbeats. Vanessa's mind raced through escape scenarios, but Kane had chosen his route well. No exits, no witnesses, just endless corridors that swallowed sound. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she managed, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. Kane stopped walking and turned to face her, his pale blue eyes studying her with the detached interest of a scientist examining a lab rat. "You were supposed to give him the glass with the rose stem. Instead, you gave him a different glass, with something extra inside." The admission hung between them like a loaded gun. Kane knew about the napkin, which meant they'd been watching every move, analyzing every gesture. The trap had been even more elaborate than she'd realized. "I did exactly what you asked," Vanessa lied, falling back on the survival skills that had carried her through 17 different foster homes. The rose stem glass was right there on the tray. Was it? Kane's smile was razor thin. Then why didn't he drink it? Before Vanessa could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message. Kane plucked it from her apron pocket with practiced ease, his eyebrows rising as he read the screen. "Emergency in the ballroom. All staff report immediately." "Management," Kane's expression darkened. "Interesting timing." 3 floors above, Richard Musk stood in the ballroom's men's lounge, staring at his reflection in the gilt-framed mirror while his mind processed the impossible chain of events. The napkin lay unfolded on the marble counter beside him, its 3 words written in careful block letters that spoke of someone trying very hard not to be identified by their handwriting. "Champagne is poisoned." For 20 minutes, he'd been turning those words over in his mind like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. The waitress, Vanessa, according to her name tag, had risked everything to warn him. For what? They'd never met. She had no reason to care whether he lived or died. Unless Richard pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never wanted to use. "Davidson." The voice was crisp, military. "Musk, I need a full background check on a Vanessa Hunt. Works at the Grandview Hotel. And I need it 5 minutes ago." "Sir, you're supposed to be maintaining radio silence. Plans change. Get me everything. Birth records, employment history, known associates." "And Davidson?" "Flag any connections to Blackwood or Kane." Richard ended the call and studied his reflection again. In the harsh bathroom lighting, he looked older than his 48 years, the weight of constant vigilance etched in the lines around his eyes. For 3 years, he'd lived like a ghost in his own life, trusting no one, connecting with nothing, existing purely to survive the next assassination attempt. And now a stranger had handed him his life back with a folded napkin. The bathroom door opened behind him, and Marcus Blackwood entered with the confident stride of a man who owned every room he walked into. At 55, he was silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of political charisma that had made him billions in defense contracts and oil rights. "Richard, there you are. You missed quite a show out there." Richard turned slowly, his expression neutral. "Oh." One of the waitresses had some kind of episode. Started babbling about poison drinks and assassination plots. Security had to restrain her. Blackwood's laugh was perfectly calibrated, concerned but not too worried, dismissive but not cruel. Poor thing was clearly having some sort of breakdown. The words hit Richard like ice water. They had Vanessa. And they were already crafting the narrative that would explain away her accusations as the ravings of an unstable employee. "How unfortunate," Richard said carefully. "I hope she gets the help she needs." "Oh, she will." Vincent Kane is personally ensuring she receives appropriate medical attention. The threat couldn't have been clearer if Blackwood had held a gun to Richard's head. They had the waitress who'd saved his life, and her continued breathing depended entirely on his cooperation. "Speaking of Kane," Richard said, his voice betraying nothing, "I believe he mentioned wanting to discuss some business opportunities." "Indeed." Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. "He's quite eager to finalize certain arrangements. Shall we rejoin the party?" As they walked back toward the ballroom, Richard felt the familiar weight of calculations settling over him like armor. Every word would matter now. Every gesture would be analyzed. One wrong move and the woman who'd risked everything to save him would pay the price. But Marcus Blackwood had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that threatening Vanessa would make Richard more compliant. Instead, it had just made him more dangerous. In the service corridor, Kane's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He answered without taking his eyes off Vanessa. "Yes." His voice was clipped, impatient. Vanessa couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Kane's expression shift from annoyance to surprise to something that might have been concern. "Are you certain?" Kane asked. Then, after a pause, "No, don't move her yet. I'll be right there." He ended the call and studied Vanessa with new interest, as if seeing her for the first time. "It seems, Miss Hund, that you've become quite valuable. Mr. Musk is asking questions about you. Very specific questions." Vanessa's heart hammered against her ribs. Richard was looking for her, which meant either he was trying to help or he was trying to eliminate the one person who could connect him to the failed assassination attempt. "I don't know what you want me to say," she whispered. "Nothing, my dear. You've said quite enough already." Kane's smile was predatory. "But Mr. Musk's sudden interest in your welfare presents us with new opportunities. Tell me, what exactly did you write on that napkin?" The question hung in the air like a spider's web. Kane already knew about the napkin, but he didn't know what was written on it. Which meant their surveillance hadn't been as complete as they'd pretended. Vanessa made a choice that would haunt her for weeks to come. "I told him I recognized him," she lied, her voice gaining strength. "From the magazines. I asked for his autograph." Kane's eyes narrowed. "An autograph? I've never met anyone famous before. I thought maybe he'd remember me kindly if I ever needed a reference." It was exactly the kind of starstruck behavior that a young waitress might exhibit. Innocent enough to be believable, foolish enough to be dismissed. Kane studied her for a long moment, weighing her words against what he knew about human nature. "How wonderfully naive," he said finally. "And Mr. Musk's reaction?" "He seemed annoyed. Like I was bothering him." Vanessa let a note of disappointment creep into her voice. Rich people don't like being reminded that they're different. Kane's laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, my dear girl. You have no idea how different he really is. What would you do if you were caught between powerful people playing deadly games? Would you trust the billionaire who's asking questions, or assume he's just protecting himself? Drop your thoughts below. Sometimes the most dangerous person might be your only hope." The overhead lights flickered, and somewhere in the distance, an alarm began to wail. Kane's phone buzzed again, this time with rapid-fire text. Messages that made his face go pale. "It seems," he said slowly, "that Mr. Musk has just transferred $50 million to an offshore account owned by a certain hotel employee. Retroactive payment for security consulting services." Vanessa's mouth fell open. "What?" "Congratulations, Miss Hund. You've just become a very wealthy woman." which makes you a very dangerous liability. The alarm grew louder, and Kane's expression shifted from predatory amusement to cold calculation. Whatever game Richard was playing, he just changed all the rules. And Vanessa was about to discover that being saved by a billionaire was infinitely more complicated than saving one. The fire alarm's shrill cry echoed through the Grandview Hotel's corridors as emergency lights bathed everything in hellish red. Vincent Kane's carefully laid plans were unraveling faster than a cheap suit in a thunderstorm, and his pale blue eyes had taken on the dangerous glint of a cornered predator. $50 million, he repeated, his manicured fingers tightening around Vanessa's wrist until she winced. That's quite generous for an autograph, don't you think? Before Vanessa could respond, Kane's phone exploded with incoming calls. The first was from Marcus Blackwood, his voice crackling through the speaker with barely controlled rage. "Vincent, what the hell is happening? Musk just announced he's donating $100 million to a workers' rights foundation, live on the ballroom's main screen. The press is going insane. Half our investors are asking questions we can't answer." Kane's jaw clenched. He's creating chaos to cover his tracks. Standard corporate warfare. This isn't warfare, it's suicide. He's making himself untouchable. You can't assassinate a man in the middle of becoming a public saint. The second call came from Kane's head of security. "Sir, we have a problem. Hotel security is conducting a full building sweep. They're checking every room, every corridor. We need to evacuate the asset." Vanessa realized with growing horror that she was the asset, the disposable witness who was supposed to die of a convenient heart attack after delivering the poisoned champagne. But Richard's financial maneuvers had turned her into something far more dangerous, a person whose sudden death would raise uncomfortable questions. Kane ended both calls and turned to study her with the cold calculation of a chess master whose opponent had just captured his queen. "It seems, Miss Hund, that your billionaire has forced us into an unexpected partnership. We can't eliminate you without triggering a federal investigation. And we can't let you go without ensuring your continued discretion." The emergency lights flickered as hotel security teams swept through the upper floors. Kane made a decision that would bind 3 lives together in ways none of them anticipated. Change of plans. "We're leaving. Now." 23 floors above, Richard Musk stood in the ballroom's center, surrounded by a hurricane of cameras, microphones, and shouted questions. His impromptu press conference had turned Marcus Blackwood's elegant assassination party into a media circus that would be front-page news by morning. "Mr. Musk, can you confirm the rumors about a $50 million payment to a hotel employee? Mr. Musk, is it true you're considering running for political office? Mr. Musk, what's your response to allegations that tonight's party was meant to discuss illegal monopolization practices?" Richard fielded each question with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned to weaponize publicity. Every statement was calculated to create maximum disruption while revealing nothing of substance. But his steel-gray eyes constantly swept the crowd, searching for one face that wasn't there. Vanessa Hund had disappeared. His phone buzzed with a text from Davidson, his security chief. Background check complete. Vanessa Hund, 24, orphaned at 6, 17 foster homes, aged out of system at 18. No criminal record. No known associates. Employment history: diner waitress, hotel housekeeping, retail clerk. Current address: studio apartment above Murphy's Deli, Brooklyn. So, she's completely clean. No connections to Blackwood, Kane, or anyone else. The implications hit Richard like a sledgehammer. Vanessa hadn't saved his life as part of some elaborate double-cross or corporate espionage scheme. She'd risked everything for a complete stranger because it was the right thing to do. In his world of calculated moves and hidden agendas, such pure motivation was rarer than unicorns. And now she was missing. Richard's jaw tightened as he processed the tactical situation. Kane would need to keep Vanessa alive, at least temporarily, because her sudden death would trigger the very investigation they were trying to avoid. But alive didn't mean safe, and every minute she remained in their custody increased the likelihood that she'd become a liability they couldn't afford to maintain. He had perhaps 6 hours before Kane's cost-benefit analysis shifted from preservation to elimination. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice cutting through the media chaos like a sword through silk, "I'm afraid I must cut this short. I've just received word of a family emergency that requires my immediate attention." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but as he pushed through the crowd toward the exit, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine urgency driven not by self-preservation, but by the need to protect someone else, someone who'd already proven she was willing to die for him. The abandoned subway maintenance tunnel beneath Manhattan's financial district hadn't seen regular use since the 1970s, but it served Kane's purposes perfectly, isolated, soundproof, and connected to a network of service passages that could smuggle someone in or out of the city without detection. Vanessa sat on a moldy wooden crate, her wrists bound with plastic zip ties, watching Kane pace the narrow space like a caged animal. His expensive suit looked ridiculous in the industrial setting, but the gun holstered under his left armpit was anything but amusing. "This is insane," she said, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You can't just kidnap people because a business deal went wrong." Kane stopped pacing and turned to her with a smile that belonged in a mortuary. "My dear girl, you have no idea what people like us are capable of when billions of dollars are at stake. People like you maybe. But I'm not." "You're not what?" "Important enough to matter." Kane's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "You stopped being unimportant the moment you handed Richard Musk that napkin. You became a witness to attempted murder. More than that, you became proof of his moral flexibility." Vanessa frowned. "What do you mean?" "He saved you, didn't he? Transferred $50 million to ensure your safety. Made himself look like a humanitarian saint in front of the cameras." Kane's pale eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "But what happens when the media discovers that his mysterious beneficiary is the same waitress who was present during an alleged assassination attempt? What conclusions do you think they'll draw?" The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Richard's efforts to protect her had created a paper trail that could be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. If Kane played his cards correctly, he could destroy Richard's reputation while simultaneously eliminating the witness to his own crimes. "You're going to frame him," Vanessa whispered. "Frame is such an ugly word. I prefer contextualize." The narrative writes itself. Wealthy businessman stages his own assassination attempt, pays off the waitress who helped him, then uses the publicity to enhance his public image and political prospects. Kane's phone buzzed, and his expression shifted as he read the incoming message. "Speak of the devil," he murmured. "It seems your knight in shining armor is looking for you. How romantic." He showed her the screen. "I know you have her. Name your price." Musk. Vanessa's heart hammered against her ribs. Richard was trying to negotiate for her release, which meant he was walking directly into Kane's web. "You're going to kill him?" she said. "Eventually. But first, we're going to have a conversation about the future. His future, your future, and how they might intersect in ways that benefit everyone involved. Kane typed a response, Pier 47, midnight. Come alone, or she dies slowly. The message sent with a soft chime that sounded like a death knell in the abandoned tunnel. As Kane settled back to wait for midnight, Vanessa found herself thinking about the moment she'd pressed that napkin into Richard's champagne glass. She'd expected to save his life and probably lose her own. She hadn't expected to matter to him afterward, but the evidence was undeniable. Richard Musk, a man who could buy and sell small countries, was willing to walk into a death trap for a waitress he'd met once. The question was, would that be enough to save them both, or would it simply ensure they died together? 3 hours until midnight. 3 hours to figure out how two people from completely different worlds could survive in a game where the rules kept changing and the stakes were measured in heartbeats. The rain began falling at 10:47 p.m., turning the Manhattan streets into rivers of reflected neon as Richard Musk sat in the back of his armored Mercedes, staring at a photograph he hadn't looked at in 15 years. His hands that had signed billion-dollar deals and shaken with presidents, trembled as he traced the edges of the faded image that it showed a 6-year-old girl with auburn hair and startling green eyes, wearing a yellow sundress that was 2 sizes too big. She was standing beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of a woman who looked exactly like her but aged by pain and chemotherapy. Written on the back in careful cursive were the words, Emma and Mommy, St. Mary's Children's Hospital, July 15, 2009. Richard's chest tightened as memories he'd buried under decades of corporate success came flooding back. Emma Hund, the little girl who'd called him Uncle Richie and made him promise to take care of her if anything happened to her mother. The little girl whose mother had been his college sweetheart, his first love, the woman he'd planned to marry before cancer stole her away at 28, the woman whose last words had been, "Promise me you'll find Emma. Promise me you'll make sure she's safe." He tried. God knows he tried. But the foster system had swallowed 6-year-old Emma like quicksand, and every private investigator, every favor called in, every $1 million donation to children's charities had led to dead ends and sealed records. After 5 years of searching, Richard had finally accepted that the little girl with Sarah's eyes was lost to him forever. He'd thrown himself into building his empire with the single-minded fury of a man trying to outrun his own guilt. Every success was a monument to his failure to keep the one promise that had mattered. Now, 18 years later, Davidson's background check had revealed a truth that made Richard's hands shake. Vanessa Hund, born Emma Vanessa Hund, orphaned at 6 when her mother Sarah died of leukemia, had been renamed by the state when she entered foster care to protect her from a father who'd never acknowledged her existence. The little girl he'd spent 5 years searching for had been hiding in plain sight, serving champagne to the man who'd loved her mother more than life itself, and she had no idea who he was. 3 miles away, in the abandoned subway tunnel, Vanessa stared at the water stains on the concrete ceiling and tried not to think about the gun Vincent Kane kept checking every 15 minutes. But her mind wouldn't cooperate, drifting instead to memories she'd spent years trying to forget. "Tell me about your mother," Kane said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He'd been studying her face for the past hour with the intensity of a man solving a puzzle. "She's dead." Vanessa's voice was flat, emotionless. "Has been for 18 years. "Yes, but what was she like before the cancer?" The casual reference to her mother's illness made Vanessa's blood freeze. She'd never mentioned cancer to Kane, never told him how her mother died. Which meant he knew more about her past than he was letting on. "How do you know about the cancer?" Kane's smile was sharp as winter wind. "My dear girl, when you're planning to kill someone, You research everyone in their orbit. Even ancient history becomes relevant. Kane pulled out a tablet and swiped through several documents before settling on one that made Vanessa's breath catch. It was her original birth certificate, the one that had been sealed when she entered foster care. Emma Vanessa Hund, born October 12, 1999. Mother, Sarah Elizabeth Hund, age 22. Father, unknown. Emma, Kane said, tasting the name like fine wine. That's quite different from Vanessa, isn't it? Tell me, do you remember anything about the man who used to visit you and your mother at the hospital? Vanessa's world tilted on its axis. She remembered fragments, a tall man with kind eyes who brought her books and called her Little Star. A voice that made her mother smile even when the medicine made her sick. Strong hands that lifted her up to see the city lights from the hospital window while he and her mother talked in whispers about grown-up things. He had gray eyes, she whispered, the memory surfacing like a dream. And he always smelled like coffee and expensive cologne. Richard Musk drinks 12 cups of coffee a day, Kane observed casually. Has since college. And he's worn the same Tom Ford cologne for 20 years. The implications hit Vanessa like a physical blow. The man she'd saved tonight, the billionaire who'd risked everything to protect her, was the same person who'd held her hand during her mother's final days. The uncle figure who'd disappeared from her life when she was 6, leaving her to navigate the foster system alone. He knew, she breathed. Tonight, when he saw my name tag. Oh, he knew long before tonight, Kane interrupted. Richard Musk doesn't attend parties thrown by his enemies without extensive reconnaissance. He knew exactly who you were the moment he walked into that ballroom. Vanessa's mind reeled as puzzle pieces clicked into place. Richard's reaction when she'd said his name. The way he'd looked at her like he was seeing a ghost. The $50 million transfer that had seemed so impulsive but now felt like 18 years of guilt crystallized into action. He's been looking for you, Kane continued, clearly enjoying her shock. Did you know he donated $400 million to foster care reform over the past 15 years? Funded 3 private investigation firms that specialized in finding missing children? He even tried to have the adoption records unsealed, but your case was classified due to your father's complicated circumstances. My father. Kane's smile turned predatory. Oh yes, that's the beautiful irony of this whole situation. Your father isn't unknown, dear Emma. He's just criminal. Vincent Kane Sr., my dear departed father, had quite the reputation for leaving consequences scattered across the city, including one 6-year-old daughter he never bothered to claim. The tunnel seemed to spin around Vanessa as the final piece of Kane's twisted game revealed itself. This wasn't just about killing Richard Musk for market share. This was personal revenge served cold across 2 decades. You're my brother, she whispered. Half-brother, Kane corrected, and the son who had to watch his father obsess over the brilliant Richard Musk while ignoring his own flesh and blood. Do you know what it's like to spend your childhood competing with a stranger for a dead man's attention? Kane's composure cracked for the first time, revealing the rage that had been festering for 20 years. Father left everything to Musk Industries in his will. Said Richard had more vision than his own son. Can you imagine the humiliation? Vanessa stared at the man who shared her DNA and felt nothing but revulsion. Where her hard childhood had taught her compassion, his privilege had bred only entitlement and cruelty. So you decided to destroy him. I decided to take everything he cared about, the same way he took everything from me. Kane's pale eyes glittered with malice. His company, his reputation, his life. And now, the little girl he spent 15 years trying to find. Kane's phone buzzed with an incoming message. On my way. Don't hurt her. How touching, Kane murmured. He's coming to save you, just like he promised your mother he would. Too bad he's 18 years too late. But as Kane prepared for Richard's arrival, Vanessa felt something shifting inside her chest. The scared little girl who'd bounced between foster homes was dissolving, replaced by a woman who finally understood her place in the world. She wasn't just a random waitress who'd stumbled into a corporate war. She was the daughter of the woman Richard Musk had loved and lost. She was the little girl he'd spent half his fortune trying to find. And she was the last living link between a man who'd built an empire and the heart he'd buried with her mother. As midnight approached, Vanessa closed her eyes and made a silent promise to the mother she barely remembered and the man who'd never stopped searching. Whatever happened at Pier 47, she wouldn't let 18 years of love and loss end in Vincent Kane's twisted revenge. Some promises, she realized, were worth dying to keep. Pier 47 stretched into the Hudson River like a concrete finger pointing toward secrets that should have stayed buried. The rain had intensified, turning the abandoned dock into a symphony of drumming water and creaking metal. At 11:58 p.m., Richard Musk stood at the pier's entrance, watching Vincent Kane emerge from the shadows with Vanessa beside him. Even from 50 yards away, Richard could see the resemblance to Sarah that had haunted his dreams for 18 years. The stubborn set of her jaw when she was afraid but refused to show it. The way she held her shoulders straight despite being bound and terrified. The green eyes that had looked at him with such trust when she was 6 years old and called him Uncle Richie. "Let her go, Kane," Richard called out, his voice carrying across the water. "This is between us." Kane's laugh echoed off the empty warehouses. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, Richard. This has always been about her. The little girl you couldn't save. The promise you couldn't keep." Richard stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Emma." The name hit Vanessa like lightning. She looked up sharply, meeting Richard's gray eyes across the rain-soaked pier, and saw 18 years of grief and guilt and desperate hope reflected back at her. "You remember," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I never forgot." Richard's voice broke on the words. "Not for a single day." Kane's grip tightened on Vanessa's arm. How touching. The great Richard Musk, brought to his knees by sentiment. Father would have been disgusted. "Your father was a good man who made one terrible mistake," Richard replied, never taking his eyes off Vanessa. "He left his fortune to someone who would honor it instead of squander it on revenge." "Enough." Kane pulled out his gun and pressed it to Vanessa's temple. "You want to play happy families? Fine. Tell me where you've hidden the Prometheus files, and maybe I'll let you have 5 minutes to reminisce before I kill you both." Richard went very still. The Prometheus files contained evidence of every illegal arms deal, every bribed politician, every murdered whistleblower that Kane's network had orchestrated over the past decade. They were Richard's insurance policy and Kane's death warrant if they ever saw daylight. "The files are in a safe deposit box," Richard said carefully. "Sealed. If anything happens to me, they get released automatically." "Yes, I know." Kane's smile was sharp as broken glass. "But you see, Richard, I've spent 2 years planning for this moment. I know about your dead man switches, your backup protocols, your contingency plans. What I'm counting on is your one weakness." Kane pressed the gun harder against Vanessa's temple, and she flinched but didn't cry out. "You won't let her die. Not again. Not when you've finally found her." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, 3 lives balanced on. the edge of violence. But something was happening in the space between Richard and Vanessa, a recognition that transcended the danger surrounding them. She was remembering the smell of his cologne when he hugged her goodbye that last day at the hospital. The way he'd read her favorite story about a brave princess who saved everyone she loved. The whispered promise he'd made to her mother, "I'll find her, Sarah. I swear to you, I'll find her." "You kept looking," Vanessa said, her voice growing stronger despite the gun at her head. "Even after the trail went cold. Even after everyone said I was probably dead." Richard nodded, rain streaming down his face like tears. "I hired every investigator on the East Coast. Donated to every children's charity in the country. I thought maybe if I could help enough other kids find their families, you'd forgive yourself for losing me. I'd earned the right to call myself your family." Kane's patience snapped. "This is precious, truly, but shut up, Vincent." Vanessa's voice cut through his words like a blade. For the first time since the tunnel, she turned to look directly at her half-brother. "You want to know what our father would think? He'd be ashamed. Ashamed that his son chose revenge over redemption. You don't know anything about, I know everything about being abandoned. About growing up believing you're not worth loving. About wondering every day why the people who were supposed to protect you walked away instead." Vanessa's green eyes blazed with 18 years of pain transformed into purpose. "But I also know the difference between someone who leaves because they don't care and someone who leaves because they have no choice." She looked back at Richard, and something passed between them that made Kane step backward despite himself. "You never stopped looking," she said again, wonder creeping into her voice. "All those donations to foster care reform. All those private investigators. You were looking for me." "Every day," Richard whispered. "Every single day." Kane raised the gun higher, but his hand was shaking now. The control he'd maintained throughout the evening was slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Touch and go as this reunion is," he snarled. "It ends now. The files, Richard. Or she dies." Instead of answering Kane, Richard spoke directly to Vanessa, his voice gentle despite the chaos around them. "Do you remember the story I used to read to you? About the princess who was brave enough to save everyone?" Vanessa's breath caught. "The Princess and the 7 Stars. What did she do when the dragon had her cornered?" Vanessa's eyes widened as she understood. She trusted her friends to catch her. Richard nodded almost imperceptibly. "On 3. Kane looked between them, confusion replacing confidence. "What are you?" "1, Richard said quietly. Vanessa shifted her weight, calculating angles and distances. 2. Kane swung the gun toward Richard. "Stop whatever you're." 3. Vanessa threw herself sideways off the pier, her bound hands making the movement awkward but effective. Kane's shot went wide as he lunged to grab her, and Richard was already moving, 20 years of private security training compressed into 3 seconds of lethal precision. The gun flew into the Hudson River. Kane followed it a moment later, Richard's tackle sending both men over the edge of the pier. Vanessa hit the freezing water and immediately sank, her bound hands making it impossible to swim. Panic clawed at her throat as the Hudson River closed over her head, but then strong arms were around her, pulling her toward the surface. Richard broke through the water with Vanessa in his arms, both of them gasping and choking but alive. Kane was nowhere to be seen, swept away by the current or dragged down by his expensive suit. For a moment, they floated together in the dark water, rain falling around them like a blessing. Richard's arms tightened around Vanessa, and she could feel his heart hammering against her back. "I've got you," he whispered, the words he'd wanted to say for 18 years finally finding their voice. I've got you, little star. I'm never letting go again. Vanessa leaned back against his chest and felt something break apart inside her. All the walls she'd built, all the armor she'd worn, all the years of believing she wasn't worth searching for. Uncle Richie, she whispered, using the name she hadn't spoken since she was 6 years old. And in that moment, as they floated in the Hudson River with the city lights reflecting around them like fallen stars, two broken souls found their way back to each other. They swam to shore together, Richard keeping one arm around Vanessa even as he pulled them both toward safety. As they collapsed on the rocky beach, soaking wet and exhausted but alive, Vanessa turned to face the man who'd spent 18 years keeping a promise to a dying woman. Now what? She asked, her voice small but hopeful. Richard smiled, the first real smile he'd worn in 2 decades. Now we go home. Both of us. For the first time in her life, Vanessa knew exactly what home meant. 3 weeks later, Vanessa stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard's penthouse apartment, watching the sunrise paint Manhattan in shades of gold and amber. The silk robe he'd bought her, the first gift anyone had given her since childhood, felt like luxury against her skin, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in someone else's life. Behind her, Richard emerged from his home office, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. Since Kane's disappearance, he'd been working 18-hour days, dismantling the conspiracy that had nearly killed them both. The Prometheus files had revealed a web of corruption that reached into Congress, the Pentagon, and 3 Fortune 500 companies. You're up early, he said softly, approaching her with the careful reverence he'd shown her since that night at the pier. As if she might disappear if he moved too quickly. Couldn't sleep. Vanessa turned to face him, noting the way his gray eyes tracked her every movement. In the 3 weeks since he'd found her, Richard had given her everything. A home, a family, a future that stretched beyond her wildest dreams. But she could see the cost in the shadows under his eyes, the weight he carried in his shoulders. The nightmares again. Vanessa nodded. The dreams came every night, Vincent Kane rising from the Hudson River like a vengeful ghost, the sound of gunshots in hotel corridors, the taste of fear that lingered long after she woke. But there was something else haunting her sleep, something she hadn't told Richard about, memories of her mother's final days. Conversations she'd overheard as a 6-year-old but hadn't understood until now. Richard, she said carefully, I need to ask you something about my mother. He went very still, the way he always did when Sarah's name came up. Even after 18 years, talking about her was like pressing on a wound that had never properly healed. Of course. Anything. Did you love her? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Richard's expression softened, and for a moment, Vanessa saw him not as the billionaire who commanded armies of lawyers and politicians, but as the young man who'd fallen in love with a waitress named Sarah Hunt. More than life itself, he whispered. And she loved you. I thought she did. Before. Richard's voice trailed off, pain flickering across his features. Before what? Richard turned away, staring out at the city that had made him powerful but never happy. Before she chose your father instead. The words hit Vanessa like ice water. What? Your mother and I were engaged. We had plans, a wedding, a house in Connecticut, children. But then Vincent Kane Sr. showed up at her apartment one night, and everything changed. Richard's reflection in the window looked like a ghost haunting his own life. She broke up with me 3 days later. Said she couldn't marry me because she was pregnant with another man's child. She was protecting you even then. Vanessa felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Protecting me from what? From Kane Sr.'s enemies. From his debts, life that would have made you a target before you could even walk. Richard's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Your mother chose a hard life over a dangerous one. She chose to raise you alone rather than let you grow up in Kane's shadow. The revelation rewrote everything Vanessa thought she knew about her childhood. Her mother hadn't been abandoned by a deadbeat father. She'd deliberately chosen poverty over protection to keep her daughter safe. But you stayed in touch, Vanessa said, grasping for understanding. You visited us at the hospital. Your mother called me when she got sick. Said she needed someone she trusted to watch over you if... Richard's voice broke. She made me promise to find you a good family. To make sure you had opportunities she couldn't give you. And when she died, the state took you before I could fulfill that promise. Your case was sealed because of your father's criminal connections. I tried everything, bribes, favors, legal challenges. But you just vanished into the system. Vanessa sank into the leather chair by the window, her mind reeling with implications she wasn't ready to face. So when you found me at the hotel, I'd been tracking you for 3 weeks. My investigators finally got a breakthrough when you applied for the job at the Grandview. Richard turned to face her, his gray eyes haunted. I didn't plan for you to save my life. I was just trying to figure out how to approach you without scaring you away. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with devastating clarity. Richard hadn't been at that party by accident. He'd walked into Kane's trap knowing exactly who would be serving champagne, gambling that he could protect both of them. You used me, Vanessa whispered. No. Richard's denial was sharp, desperate. I would never. You let me think it was coincidence. You let me believe I was choosing to save a stranger. Vanessa stood, backing away from him as the full scope of his deception revealed itself. But you orchestrated the whole thing. Emma, please, don't call me that. The words exploded from her with 18 years of rage behind them. You don't get to call me that anymore. You don't get to play the loving uncle who's been searching for his lost little girl when you've been manipulating me from the moment we met. Richard stepped toward her, his hands raised in supplication. Everything I did was to protect you. The money, the media attention, even attending that party, it was all to keep you safe. Safe. Vanessa's laugh was sharp as broken glass. You walked me into a death trap. Vincent Kane had a gun to my head because of your choices. I know, and I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring back the last 18 years. Vanessa was shaking now, all the emotions she'd buried since childhood erupting like a volcano. Do you know what it's like to grow up believing nobody wants you? To spend every birthday wondering if this would be the year someone remembered you existed. Richard's face crumpled. Emma, I waited for you. The words tore from her throat like physical wounds. Every foster home, every new family, every time someone asked if I had any relatives, I told them about Uncle Richie who used to read me stories. I told them you'd come for me eventually. Tears were streaming down her face now, 18 years of abandonment crystallized into rage. But you never came. You sent investigators and lawyers and money, but you never came. Because finding me was never about loving me, it was about keeping a promise to a dead woman. The accusation hung between them like a sword. Richard's face went white, and Vanessa saw the exact moment her words found their mark. That's not true, he whispered. Isn't it? You loved my mother, not me. I'm just the consolation prize. The living reminder of what you lost. You're wrong. Am I? Then tell me, Richard, if my mother hadn't made you promise to take care of me, would you have looked for me at all? Or would you have been content to let Sarah Hunn's bastard daughter disappear into the system forever? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. It again, and Vanessa saw everything she needed to know in his hesitation. I thought so, Vanessa said, her voice flat and emotionless now. 3 weeks ago, you saved my life. But you can't save me from the truth. She walked past him toward the bedroom, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. Where are you going? Richard's voice was barely a whisper. To pack. And then I'm leaving. Emma, please. She stopped at the doorway and turned back to him one last time. My name is Vanessa. Emma died the day you decided a promise to a ghost was more important than loving a little girl who needed you. As she disappeared into the bedroom, Richard sank into the chair she'd vacated, his empire of wealth and power crumbling around him like sand. He'd spent 18 years building monuments to his guilt, but he'd never learned the difference between keeping a promise and keeping faith. Outside, the sunrise continued painting Manhattan in shades of gold, indifferent to the hearts breaking 40 floors below. Some mistakes, Richard realized too late, couldn't be fixed with money or power or good intentions. Some mistakes could only be healed with truth, and sometimes, the truth came 18 years too late. The decision came to Richard at 3:47 a.m., as he sat in his office staring at a photograph of 6-year-old Emma reading a book in his lap. For 6 hours, he'd replayed every word Vanessa had spoken, every accusation that had carved pieces from his soul. She was right about everything, the manipulation, the guilt-driven protection, the way he'd loved a memory more than the woman she'd become. But she was wrong about one thing, that he did love her. Not as Sarah's daughter, not as the fulfillment of an 18-year-old promise, but as the brave, brilliant, impossibly strong woman who'd risked everything to save a stranger's life. The woman who'd survived 17 foster homes and emerged with her capacity for compassion intact. The woman who'd looked death in the face and chosen courage over safety. The woman who deserved so much more than a guardian haunted by ghosts. Richard picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but hoped never to use. Matthews, it's Musk. I need you to draft some papers. Immediately. 2 floors below, Vanessa sat on the edge of the guest bed in her childhood apartment in Brooklyn, the same studio she'd rented above Murphy's Deli before her world turned upside down. She'd refused Richard's money, refused his offers to set her up somewhere nicer. This place was hers, earned with her own work, owned by her own choices. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Please meet me at St. Mary's Children's Hospital. Room 304. There's something you need to see. She almost deleted it. Almost let Richard Musk disappear from her life the same way he'd appeared. Suddenly, dramatically, leaving chaos in his wake. But something about the location stopped her finger from hitting delete.st. Mary's was where her mother had died. Room 304 was where they'd spent those final weeks together. Why would Richard want to meet her there? An hour later, Vanessa stood outside the hospital room that had haunted her dreams for 18 years. Through the small window, she could see Richard sitting in a chair beside the bed, not the confident billionaire who commanded boardrooms, but a broken man holding a manila envelope like it contained his last hope. She pushed open the door, and he looked up with eyes red from exhaustion and something that might have been tears. Thank you for coming, he said softly. I wasn't sure you would. What is this, Richard? Some kind of guilt trip to the place where my mother died. No. He stood slowly, moving like a man who'd aged years in the past day. It's where I'm finally going to keep my promise to her. The real promise. Vanessa frowned. What are you talking about? Richard held out the envelope. Your mother didn't just ask me to take care of you, Emma, Vanessa. She asked me to make sure you had choices. Real choices, not the ones other people made for you. Vanessa took the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were legal documents thick as a novel, dense with whereas and heretofores that made her head spin. But certain phrases jumped out at her like neon signs: Educational Trust Fund, Harvard Medical School, full tuition and living expenses, Sarah Elizabeth Hund Memorial Foundation, Director and Chief Executive, annual salary, no obligation to maintain contact with the trustee, complete autonomy in all decisions. Vanessa looked up from the papers, her voice barely a whisper. What is this? It's your freedom, Richard said simply. The foundation is real. I've been running it in your mother's name for 15 years, funding medical research and helping kids age out of foster care. But it needs someone who understands what those kids go through. Someone who's been where they are. He gestured to the papers. If you want it, the job is yours. Salary, benefits, complete control over how the money gets spent. And if you don't want it, the trust fund will pay for medical school, law school, whatever you choose to study. Vanessa's hands shook as she flipped through the documents. The salary? Richard, this is more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. You saved my life. That's worth considerably more than money. Richard's smile was sad but genuine. But that's not why I'm doing this. Then why? Richard was quiet for a long moment, looking around the hospital room where he'd said goodbye to the only woman he'd ever loved. Your mother told me something the night before she died. She said the worst thing about dying wasn't leaving you behind. It was knowing you'd grow up thinking you weren't worth loving because everyone who was supposed to protect you had walked away. His voice broke slightly. She made me promise that if I ever found you, I'd prove her wrong. Not by taking care of you, but by giving you the power to take care of yourself. Vanessa felt tears burning behind her eyes. And the foundation? Will exist whether you run it or not. Whether you ever speak to me again or not. Whether you take the job or use the trust fund to become a doctor in Tibet. Richard's gray eyes met hers with devastating honesty. Your mother was right about one thing. You deserve choices. So I'm giving them to you. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 18 years of missed opportunities and misunderstood intentions. When Vanessa finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. What about you? What about me? If I take this job, if I run the foundation, we'd have to work together. See each other regularly. After everything that's happened, Richard shook his head. The foundation is headquartered in Chicago. I'll transfer ownership completely. You'd answer to a board of directors, not to me. We'd probably see each other once a year at the annual gala, if that. The implication hit Vanessa like a physical blow. You're giving me everything and asking for nothing. I'm giving you what your mother wanted you to have, the freedom to choose your own life without anyone else's expectations weighing you down. Richard's smile was heartbreaking in its sincerity, including mine. Vanessa stared at the papers in her hands, seeing not just dollar signs and legal jargon, but possibility. The chance to help kids like she'd been. The opportunity to turn her pain into purpose. The freedom to matter in the world without owing her significance to anyone else. There's one condition, she said finally. Richard tensed. What? The foundation gets renamed. The Sarah Elizabeth Hund Memorial Foundation becomes something bigger. Something that honors all the kids who age out of the system without anyone looking for them. What would you call it? Vanessa thought of 17 foster homes, 18 years of feeling invisible, and one night when a stranger's kindness had changed everything. The Second Chances Foundation. For everyone who deserves to be found. Have you ever had to give someone their freedom even when it meant losing them? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the power to choose their own path. Richard nodded, and for the first time since she'd met him, Vanessa saw peace in his expression. Not happiness. The cost of his choices was too high for that, but the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd finally learned the difference between keeping someone and setting them free. When do you need an answer? She asked. Take all the time you need. The offer doesn't expire. Vanessa looked around the hospital room one last time, seeing it not as the place where her mother had died, but as the place where her mother's dream for her daughter's future had finally come true. I don't need time, she said quietly. I accept. As they shook hands over the documents that would change her life forever, Vanessa realized that Richard had given her something more valuable than money or opportunity, that he'd given her the chance to save herself. And sometimes, that was the greatest love of all. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next. Click on the image or video showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next. Click on the image or video showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.